Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see all of you here. And I know we also have a lot of others attending this meeting live too. I'm Jay Brown, president of the Captiva Community Panel, and thanks again for coming tonight. I think you're going to see some really interesting ideas tonight. We're going to give you a good look at what the future of Captiva looks like in terms of coming sea level rise, what the risk to us is, what it looks like today, and also some ideas, pilot projects with ways that we as a community might deal with coming sea level rise. So you'll hear about that, and you'll also hear from SCCF, Carrie Schuman, guiding principles that SCCF has established for how communities ought to go about developing sea level rise programs. The importance of trying to maintain or not destroy our ecology as we're trying to protect our communities from sea level rise. So we'll have a very, I think, interesting discussion and program for you tonight. Of course, I got to give you a little bit of a spiel on the community panel before we go on. Most of you know the Captiva Community Panel is over 20 years ago now, and we were founded because we are Captiva is such a small part of unincorporated Lee County. You know, we do not have a local government. We rely on the county for all of our rulemaking, all of our projects, programs to benefit, you know, our community. And since we're such a small part of unincorporated Lee County, it's very difficult for our voices to be heard by the county. And that's really, in a nutshell, what the role of the panel is to make sure that county understands the needs of Captiva and acts upon those needs. I think some of the panel's most important accomplishments. First, we created the Captiva Community Plan and have updated that recently. That sets forth the vision of what Captiva should always be in the future. Primarily a low density community that values the natural environment, you know, that surrounds us all. So we're the creators of the community plan, and then we have worked with the county to develop all the land use policies that are needed to fulfill that vision, and also ordinances and things that we need that are particularly important for Captiva. Recent example of that, state passed a rule a while back that said no more, you know, speed limit zones, which made no sense for us on the Roosevelt Channel. You know, with all the docks and everything along the channel, to have boats going by there at full wake and causing damage to the dock as well as to the wildlife along the channel. And thanks to David Mintz, who heads up our Government Affairs Committee, we were able to get that turned around and establish a permanent year-round no wake zone. So that's just a kind of an example of how the panel tries to function with an eye towards what our local needs are, with what these larger governing bodies try to impose upon us. Some important projects that the panel has ongoing now. Of course, I think you probably all know about the septic to sewer project that the panel's been working on. We've made a lot of progress on that this year. All of the engineering work and costing has been completed, so we've got a complete infrastructure plan in place now for Captiva. The project now, Lee County is 100% supportive of the septic to sewer conversion, and Sanibel is 100% supportive of it. Also, Sanibel has agreed that they're going to do all of our wastewater processing for us. We have to establish all the drainage, you know, system infrastructure, but Sanibel is going to take the wastewater and process it for us. So they're in the middle of doing some studies now to determine what types of changes that they're gonna have to make to their system to receive our wastewater. We should have a report from them by mid-April. We're also beginning to work with Lee County on gaining government funding assistance. This is going to be an expensive program to gain government funding assistance of this, so the property owners don't have to foot the entire bill. So I'm very hopeful that about this time next year, next season, that we will have everything we need to put together an MSTBU proposal for the community to evaluate and hopefully approve, so that we will no longer be reliant on septic systems. Some other projects that the panel is working on right now. We're working on establishing a pedestrian walkway in the village area. That's pretty close, I think, to getting done. There's just a few steps left on that project. We're looking at the possibility of widening Captiva Drive to blind path, so that we have much better bicycling safety than we have now on Captiva Drive. We're looking at the possibility of undergrounding utilities, primarily the power lines. We've got another project underway where we're looking at ways that we can try to alleviate the flooding we get in the village area following significant rainfall events now. So that's just a few of the projects that the panel is working on now. So with that little ad behind us, let's move on to tonight's program. I want to start off, we're going to hear from Dr. Carrie Schuman from SCCF, who's going to tell us about SCCF's guiding principles for mitigating wastewater in an environment such as ours. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Cheryl Hapke of Integral Consulting, who has been working with the panel for quite a long while now on understanding the specific threats to Captiva. And she's also proposed some very interesting pilot projects that I hope we will be undertaking. I do want to point out that responsibility for going forward now with sea level rise mitigation is now going to go from the Captiva Community Panel to the Captiva Erosion Prevention District. They have excellent sources of funding that are not available to the panel. We've determined that their mission can be easily expanded from just protecting the Gulf side of our island to also protecting the bay side. So after tonight, CEPD is going to be, taking the helm and using the foundation that has been established by Linda and her committee these last few years. And so with that, I'm going to ask Linda to come up and say a few words and introduce our speakers. Thank you again all for coming.
Either one. Hi, everybody. I'm Laird. Very pleased to be here, and I'm so pleased to have you all. The projects we've been working on are for our community, right? And so it's very important for me, at least, to have you here and be able to talk with you, share what we found out. We've gone through so many meetings and so many talks. I now know more about mangroves than I ever thought I would ever want to, and so does Jay for that matter. So we'll get going more to the meat of everything here. Okay. Maybe we will.
If we ever had a meeting where there was not a
Just the arrow keys. Arrow keys. Okay. No. Hold it on the presentation right here. Okay, thank you. So as Jay said, we're going to have two presentations. One is Carrie Schuman, from Carrie Schuman. She is the SCCF Coastal Resiliency Manager. She has a Ph.D. in environmental, I saw my next slide, I don't remember. But anyway, she's one of the environmentalists, okay? And then we've got, and it's going to be the principles of coastal adaptation. We have to understand how do you go about this and what's important. So SCCF has been helping us with that. Cheryl has been a workhorse for us and has done some design work on how we could adapt to sea level rise in Captiva. I, for one, was a little concerned. This doesn't mean I'm not concerned anymore, but we have solutions that can take us through many years into the future. It's going to take willpower, it's going to take money, all of those kind of things, but it's doable in my opinion. And I thought that was a tremendous outcome. Cheryl's going to tell you about ideas on how to do that. So for questions, you may ask during the presentations if you want to. Raise your hand. I will ask you to use the microphone because we're recording everything and we want to make sure that people on Zoom can hear. Online, you can submit via the Q&A function, and Ken will somehow make sure we all know about it. This is being recorded by Zoom, and it's going to be up on the panel website by this weekend. Before we really get going, I want to thank our sponsors. This is an island-wide activity. First, the host is the Captiva Civic Association. It is so proper and right here in this building because this is about our island and our community. And so I thank you, Civic Association people. Might we raise your hands for those who are part of the Civic Association? We have president, board members, Emily, you can do it too. So lots of people who are involved in that and are supporting it through the Civic Association. We have SCCF, and they have helped to fund this effort. Now, who's here from SCCF? Is it just you here, or is there anybody else today? Oh, all more. These are part of the board of SCCF. Board of SCCF, my folks. Okay, thank you. We have the CEPD, the Captiva Erosion Prevention District, who both funds Carrie's position, half of Carrie's position, and contributed to this. So can we see who is a current or past CEPD member? Okay, so we got that. We've already done the Captiva Civic Association. We also have had some individual donations to make this study possible. The Browns donated to the panel for this work. Robin and Lizola, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. Lisa, Vince and Srenda and Siegel. So I thank you all, and I think it's wonderful that it's been supported by the broad range of Captiva, not just one thing for it. On this committee, it began March 1st, 2019. The charter which we had to work on and came up with was to gather information on the effects of sea level rise's impact on Captiva, including defining our assets, which are primarily real estate, consulting experts, defining areas of vulnerabilities, and providing alternative approaches to the Captiva Community Panel resiliency adaptation. So as I put this on the slide and pull it from other slides, I said, can't she do it? We did what we were supposed to do because that's what we've got. The members, we've got bunches of members. I've been the chair. We've got panel members, current and past. Bill Riley, who's very heavily involved in the Everglades Foundation, Ann Brady, who's the Rauschenberg Foundation, Suri Segal, who helped support this financially and gave a lot of encouragement from a technical perspective. Mike Lanigan made sure we looked at seawalls. Made sure we looked at seawalls, and we just didn't say yes, we can do this from Joe Cowett is part of the Sanibel crowd. He works for the city of Sanibel, and we made sure in this in our work that we coordinated closely with Sanibel, that we have solutions, well, just so we work together. Bruce McDonald came on later, Cheryl, is there, Ryan, or Garen was part of it until he moved on, and Carrie. Kate Gooderham has done an amazing job staffing this and also providing a historical perspective. She's worked on Captiva Island for 30 years, or 40, and she has.
She was in kindergarten.
But her perspective on these planning issues, the permitting issues, have all of those kind of things, and trying to keep us on track has been valuable. Now, how do you go about doing it? So what we found out was the steps to create an adaptation plan. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection has a whole guidebook on how to do this. We said, hallelujah, when we found it. This embedding process is really not what we were about. And so we followed this process. Oh, that was interesting. Step one is we got a steering committee, which we have. We set some principles, motivations. We figured out what's the planning area backside the island. And we had different ways of doing public outreach. We didn't do as much as we wanted to because of COVID, obviously. Then we did a vulnerability assessment. The slides at the back, and you've seen them in your packages, show what it would be like under 2 feet. We found 2 feet to be a good planning horizon. Then come up with adaptation strategies. And the idea here is to prioritize what needed to be adapted and come up with ideas on how to do that. That's where we are. And I think it's a wonderful place to be able to turn it over to the CEPD. Our speakers, this is just a little bit more detailed, is you have, Carrie has a Ph.D. in interdisciplinary ecology. Now I know for sure, okay? So she knows about marine science, fisheries, birds, all of those things. And she has expertise in climate change as well. So again, she's supported by SCCF and CEPD. Cheryl Hapke is a coastal scientist. I learned there's a difference between scientists and engineers. She's up on all the science, not necessarily, well, I don't know how, I thought I knew the difference, but whatever. She's a coastal scientist with a Ph.D. in coastal geology from UC Santa Cruz. She was in the U.S. Geological Survey department. It's just the U.S. Geological Survey. Oh, in the U.S. Geological Survey for 22 years, working on coastal issues. So very well, very knowledgeable, very experienced. After taking an early retirement, which many of us have done, at least I did, she became the lead in coastal resilience for this consulting firm, Integral Consulting, and now is the lead for the East and Gulf Coast of the United States. This is an international company. And that, I think, is my part. So, any questions at this point? And if not, we're going to get to some real content instead, which would be Carrie. Okay? Thank you.
All right, so good evening, everybody. Some of what I was going to say has already been covered in depth. But just a reminder that, again, I am the Coastal Resilience Manager at SCCF, and that is a position in partnership with CEPD. And really, I was asked to, again, present on those guiding principles, but really one of the core pieces that's going to happen tonight is you're going to hear about that work from the Sea Level Rise Committee. You're going to get an opportunity to see Cheryl's designs, which are going to show you some options that protect against coastal flooding risks on the bay side of the island. And what I hope I can do through this is to give you a sense of sort of set the stage to see those designs. And so there's two things that I ideally will do is I want to talk to you a little bit about the kinds of coastal flooding risks that we're thinking about and that these kinds of designs respond to. And also to run you through those basic, I'm just going to briefly go through those guiding principles to show you what an adaptation process, ideally what a balanced adaptation process would look like. And those guiding principles we put together with our planning partners. So we had input from, we had representation from CEPD, we worked with the Sea Level Rise Committee, we also, same as Linda had mentioned, we had Sanibel representation too. So I'm gonna dive in first to talk a little bit, to give us the context of what we're really thinking of and what we're looking at for future impacts, especially around sea level rise here. So the thing is if you think about the title of my position, coastal resilience, the idea of coastal resilience is that we really are thinking about how do we bounce back or how do we really respond proactively to the kinds of risks that we are, the kinds of stresses that will impact us. And the tricky thing here is that the science says that some of these stressors will be increasing into the future. And as barrier islands, one really important category of these risks is going to be coastal flooding. And coastal flooding does have a few different components. There's rainfall, storm intensity. And when we say storm intensity, we're really thinking about hurricanes in that mix. And we're also looking at sea level rise. And it's really these last two that are important for our islands. You've got the storm piece is really the more episodic piece that unfolds, but sea level rise is the factor is really the stressor or the impact here that we're going to have to engage with over a long period of time. It's a stressor that's going to unfold over a period of time. And so, and this is what the Sea Level Rise Committee has been grappling with, and this is what those designs are focused on. And I want to talk about what that might look like for us and what those local impacts might be for us. So I think one thing to get a little bit of a backdrop on is the fact that, first of all, I know a lot of you have probably heard a little bit about the global sort of trends or story of sea level rise. And there are some really key, there's really two key factors that play into global sea level rise. And I'm going to pull you back a little bit to your chemistry class. I know it's probably been a little while, but really the two key drivers there are going to be thermal expansion of seawater. So with increasing sea surface temperatures and with increasing air temperature, right, you've got this underpinning of temperature that's going to cause seawater to expand, and that causes sea level rise. And another really important piece on the global level is going to be melting of landlocked ice. So those are your really two key global drivers. But the question for us ends up being, how do we think about our local story? What are the extra pieces there? And so we do want to, we do want to know a little bit more about our local story. And there are other things that come into play in terms of our local sea level rise. So if there's additional pieces like what does our local ocean circulation look like? Is our land rising or sinking? And so we do want to have a more localized story for what sea level rise is doing. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about what's happened and then what we expect into the future. And that's how we're going to set some context here. So if you look at that figure on the left, that is pulling data straight from our tide gauge in Fort Myers. Okay, and what you're seeing is a time series over time. And you're seeing that on average, sea level has been rising about 3 millimeters per year. Okay. The tricky thing for sea level rise in terms of what we expect into the future is what you're seeing over the past really looks like a linear trend, right? So where you see a rate that's fairly similar over time. However, with projections of sea level rise, really the rub in terms of what happens in the future is that we expect not to necessarily stay on a straight line. We expect those rates to start to conform to like a curved pathway, which means we'll see those actual rates increase. They won't stay at that 3 millimeter level indefinitely into the future. So what does that look like? Okay. So the way that sea level rise is usually presented in terms of planning is that it's presented as a series of possible futures. Okay. So what you're seeing here is these are projections or a series of possible futures for how sea level rise might unfold for our area. And what's underpinning here is that NOAA puts out a series of sea level rise projections, but these are actually pulled from a website you can go to where it pulls data from our local tide gauge. So that same tide gauge where you saw that information for Fort Myers and you saw that time series from the past, this is using that same tide gauge data to project this into the future. And so again, what you have is you have a series of potential futures. And really, there's a couple things that are being incorporated there. It's incorporated how well we understand those physical drivers that I talked about, thermal expansion of seawater, the melting of landlocked ice, and pulling in those other pieces. So there's some uncertainty around those, but our science is getting better. So one of the things that you'll notice is it says 2022 in the top corner. These are updated projections that just came out in February. So we're getting better at understanding the science around what's going to happen with sea level rise. The other piece of uncertainty here that gets incorporated in these projections as well is it also includes our behavior in terms of things like our behaviors and our climate policies and how those might play out. So there's a degree of uncertainty, and that's why these are presented as a series of possible futures, but they do give us a more balance in terms of what we might expect and over what kind of time period we might expect to see these. And so one thing that you'll see here is that probably between the time range of about 2050 to 2080 is where we might see a range. That's where you're starting to see possibilities of about 1.5 feet to 2 feet of sea level rise. And that's something that Cheryl will be able to kind of anchor her work as you see how she looked at vulnerability and what her designs are looking at. Okay, and now, so I wanted to give you that context and that backdrop, but I'm going to change gears here and talk about those guiding principles and set that stage again for Cheryl to talk about her work. And so these guiding principles really, these were developed in acknowledgement of the fact that we have really unique island systems out here between Captiva and Sanibel that you can choose to live and work lots of places, but people come here for a very particular quality of life. And it's that balance between the small town feel, it's that balance with nature, and there's those pieces that are important to the people who live out here. And so these principles basically acknowledge that we don't have to adapt in a certain way, but if we do, there's certain benefits or certain dividends that we can expect to see. Okay? And really the motivation here is that these principles derive from values that we want to see from whomever is working on coastal adaptation on our islands. These can be used to assist decision-making and planning and to help guide us towards a balanced adaptation process. And I think as an organization and for a lot of our organizations, another thing that we care about and feel is important is a continuity and vision and approach into the future, because we know that we've got a lot of people very engaged in working on sea level rise and working on these coastal flooding issues in our future right now. But I'm sorry, I just got a bugger. Might need to take a sip of water or something, but we'll see. But at any rate, so we've got a really engaged group of people working on this issue, but we know that that this is an issue that's going to unfold over time, and so we're going to need to continue engaging with this issue, and so we're going to have different people working on this issue into the future. So this is really creating a foundation that can be carried forward and create that continuity and that vision that sets the future. So I'm going to run you through, and I'm not going to belabor these. We put these together in a document that do have these articulated very nicely, but I'm just going to talk about. We're over here. I am just going to talk about the overarching ideas that are captured here, and there are 4 sections. So there's a general section, environmental, infrastructure, and economic. These weren't set up to be hierarchical; they're all important. The other thing is that these were drawn from local sources and language, and so that means that's a Captiva Community Plan as it sits within the LEAD plan. That's the Sanibel plan, and other similar efforts, and language derived from other similar efforts of other coastal communities who are grappling with the same as we are. And one thing I should say before I dive into this as well is we really tried, again, we had that Sandoval representation too. So we tried to set these up so that they really did represent values for both of our communities. And so the first piece here is that we want to be planning not for just current conditions, we want to be thinking about future climate. We want to use the best available science and technical know-how that we have available to us. And we want to act adaptively. And I think there's two ways to think about the adaptive piece. It's really important in this planning process. And the first is that acting adaptively is associated with the fact that we're going to get better at this. And I don't just mean our community, I mean globally, I mean all the coastal communities who are doing this. Our science is going to get better, our process is going to get better. So we're going to figure it, so we want to incorporate that into our process. But the other way that I think about adaptive that I think is important is when we think about our solutions, are they adaptable? And so that's something I want you to pay attention to in Cheryl's designs that I think are important. In Cheryl's designs and designs like these, is one of the real benefits is that as you go, you can adapt or modify these kinds of designs. And that's a really strong asset to these types of designs. Also, the impact should not, the impacts don't stop at borders. And so I think there's opportunity for us as we're best able to, for both our communities to work together when we can, when it makes sense to decrease impacts on one another, but also to derive benefits for both of us. So those are just pictures of some of our shared infrastructure and just highlights opportunities for us where we may be able to find opportunities for mutual benefit for both our island communities. Also, we want to see consistency of what we develop as a process. We need to be consistent with the pre-existing plans that are part of how we exist out here. And so that's a nod again to the Sandoval plan, to the Captiva Community Plan. I think this piece is so important, and this is really demonstrative of having events like this tonight. We know that the public participation part is so vital to this. And so that's why we need to be having events like we're having tonight to have that dialogue and let you know what everybody's been working on. Now moving into the environmental. So we know that we've got this really important balance with the environment. And so, for example, this is a principle that considers the beach environment, and in fact, it's a very important, invaluable coastal habitat. And so we want solutions that consider the impacts to and try and avoid the consequences to our protected sea turtles and our shorebirds. We want solutions that preserve the shoreline and natural habitats, enhance water quality, incorporate native vegetation, maintain the mangrove fringe, and limit noise, light, water, and air pollution. And this actually derives straight from the Captiva Community Plan vision statement. So I know this is something that the community panel worked on to try and to gather everybody's feedback on what the values are for Captiva. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on these next 2 or 3 slides because I think these will really anchor you in some of what you're seeing in Cheryl's work. So first, we want to enhance the persistent and healthy coastal ecosystems with sea level rise, and we want them to flourish. But one of the key things is that they're a really key part of our ability to adapt and to respond to those coastal flooding risks. And so, mangroves have that protective capacity against wind and wave energy. You have a lot of these habitats that will help us, they have the capacity to keep up with sea level rise in the right conditions. And this figure helps you think about this sort of multiple lines of defense approach. And this has been embraced in some different areas. But it's this idea of saying, there are instances where we will want to use some hardened infrastructure in more made pieces, but that there are instances where we can sort of bolster the protective ability of those by having our intact coastal systems that protect us, or ecosystems that protect us, but they're also going to provide other things that we care about, other benefits that help us with our water quality, provide us recreational opportunities like fishing and boating that we care about. And so this really feeds into this next principle, and we're getting into infrastructure here, which is we want preferential use whenever possible, is we want to rely on something that we call green and hybrid infrastructure. And what that means, so green means we're either going to use intact coastal ecosystems, or we're going to restore or add living components like mangrove plantings, or we'll use natural materials. If we use just those are going to be called green infrastructure. If we combine them in an approach that uses some of those hardened components like seawalls, that's where we call it hybrid approach. And we want to use those preferentially over are just the hardened options. And that's in part because some of those hardened options, you know, they do have some impacts both environmentally, and they're not the perfect solutions. There can be erosive impacts. So when you do that combination in the right settings, you can really get benefits of both and have them work together, especially in these hybrid situations. We want adaptation strategies that protect human life, public and private property, coastal resources, and that are prioritized in a manner that is equitable in our communities. And the last piece here is our economics, is we recognize that protecting infrastructure, it is invaluable to protecting our tax base. One of the really important pieces for us here in both Captiva and Senegal is maintaining, whenever possible, the economic driver of beach recreation, because it is such an important economic driver to the area. And lastly, that we want to be thinking about the cost relative, or the benefit relative to the cost of these solutions. And in the instances where we're using these green or hybrid approaches, we know that they may be giving us other things that we value in the area. And so as best as we can, and when appropriate, that we want to represent and consider those co-benefits. Okay, and so in summary, what I really want to do is just kind of recap what we went through and set the stage to hand things over to Cheryl. So these principles were meant to really represent a vision of what we want our adaptation process to look like, including our solutions. Again, you're going to see these, you're going to see some specific designs that represent part of that adaptation process and potential solutions for the bayside that in response to those coastal flooding risks that I set out at the beginning of this. And what you'll see in these designs is that they're representative of many of the principles that I presented today. So again, I'm you know, happy to have you here this one, but now I'm going to hand the stage over to Cheryl.
Yes. All right. Well, I know you've been listening to people talk actually for almost 45 minutes now, so I'm going to try to wake you back up. Check in with yourself with that. I'm not sure.
Oh, sure.
I'm not sure. Sure. All right. All right. So anyway, so try to sit up in your chair and pay a little more attention. But so we've heard everybody leading up to this project is going to describe some conceptual adaptation designs that myself and my company came up with for the community. Do you want to put in the presentations? I am not being efficient. Now I got it. Again, sponsors, want to point those out, so I don't want to go through those, but I do really need to acknowledge that this work would have been possible without the contributions of the folks listed here. Again, Linda already introduced my bio, but I do have the Ph.D. in coastal geology and retirement after 22 years in federal service. And currently have been working with communities and coastal facilities, different developments to understand and model coastal hazard, conduct vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, actually conduct economic cost benefit, as Carrie was kind of alluding to. And then today here we are at the point where we've developed some conceptual adaptation plans. So I also hold a research professorship at the University of South Florida College of Marine Science. In 2021, I was awarded the Johns Distinguished Lecturer and a presidential citation from the Association of Environmental and Engineering Geologists. I have over 80 peer-reviewed papers and books, chapters, and such, and have served as a coastal science expert across the country and internationally. So I love what I do, and I'm very passionate about it. So I keep at it. So the background and scope of this particular effort was we had previously conducted a vulnerability assessment. We did present that to the community. It was during COVID, so it was a remote virtual presentation. But that report and the maps are in the back, but they're also available on Captiva's website. So what we looked at is from baseline sea level, we looked at what would you know, what's gonna happen on the island with 1, 2, and 4 feet of sea level rise into the future. Note that our assessment only included sea level rise, not storms. Storms are important. You know, we have plans in the future to incorporate storms. We've been trying to get funding for that. We've submitted grant proposals to do the full assessments for both Captiva and Sanibel. So we haven't hit it yet, but we're still hopeful. So after we conducted the vulnerability assessments, Captiva and the sponsors that you saw there funded my company to develop conceptual design for the 2 feet. The 2 feet of sea level rise, by the time you get to 4 feet, there's gonna be problems that are gonna be difficult to solve. 2 feet, maybe, yeah, I hate to throw out the year because we just don't know when sea level rise is gonna accelerate. Maybe it's 2040, 2050, 2060, we just don't know yet. We're learning more all the time. But that was the design scenario that they chose. And then picked 5 priority areas, which I'll show you. And then we took those areas, did evaluations of characteristics of each one of those sites. And we are here tonight to present our results to you, get any feedback you have or suggestions, and we'll be finalizing a technical memorandum that will be available to you, the community. And I'm not going to go through this. Linda already showed it. These are the steps we've been following throughout the way. And right now we're in the lower left-hand corner, or number 3, which is adaptation strategies. So this is the vulnerability, the results of the vulnerability assessment for 2 feet of sea level rise. Again, these are posted in the back, and you can zoom in on ones that are available on the community website. But what you see is, you know, the front side is because of the beach nourishment program, the CPD's ongoing work to nourish the beaches. The beaches are not that vulnerable, but everywhere you see this blue, dark blue, that is water, where water is going to be regularly flooding the landscape, and the dominant vulnerabilities are on the bay side of Captiva. So it's worse in some areas than others. That has to do with the elevation, among other factors. So taking the results of that, I worked together with the community, with the committee that Linda heads up, and we identified 5 areas that seemed to be the highest priority. First one was Chadwick Bayou, in this area shown in the box, which I zoomed in down here. And why this area? Well, Plantation Road is going to be very, very vulnerable. But we evaluated then, in order to consider different designs, we had to evaluate different site characteristics. Chadwick Bayou has very low exposure to waves because of the mangrove, because of the shoal offshore that you can't really see here. There's a lot of accommodation space. By that, I mean, there's a lot of space to build out. It doesn't go drop off into something like Roosevelt Channel. Low gradient, it's not steep. There's not much tidal flow activity here, and there are protected seagrass beds. So those things have to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about what kind of adaptation solutions or strategies we can develop. This slide shows areas 2 and 3, both in the village. You might say, well, they're right next to each other. Why not just make them one? Aha, well, that has to do with the orientation of the coastline. So, you know, the number 2 is oriented this way. Number 3 is oriented in this direction. That means that if a particular storm was coming from a particular direction, if the wind-generated waves were coming straight on, they would greatly impact this section of coast, but not so much the area in section 3. So they are actually quite different. They have a moderate accommodation space, kind of equal tidal flow. Maybe number 3 a little bit more than number 2, but there's variations in the depths, and they have different orientations. So we have to consider adaptation solutions differently. And this is showing 4 and 5. Number 4 is just a place that we picked that had some high incursion of water at 2 foot of sea level rise, but it's also an area that's completely protected by Buck Key. So there's no chance that any wind-generated waves coming across Pine Island Sound will impact the coastline, because those waves and winds would be buffered by Buck Key. So the characteristic, really no exposure to wave, some tidal flow impacts, and not a lot of room to work with, not a lot of space to build things out. Number 5 is a fairly difficult site. We chose it because, again, there's fairly deep into the landscape incursions of water, but also it's a unusual situation sited at the confluence of Roosevelt Channel and Fly's Pass. And its characteristics, there can be some exposure to waves. I mean, there are some of the keys up here, but there is a possibility of wave exposure. You've got large tidal flow impacts. These things have to be considered, and not a lot of room to work with at this site. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's what we're considering. Carrie touched on this. I'm not going to belabor this, but we did a lot of research. We looked at what types of adaptation strategies were viable in similar settings, that is subtropical, estuarine environments. And we considered everything from different green and gray to gray being harder, green being softer. So green versus gray, we evaluated the design and the design elements, the things that kind of were our guiding principles for the designs, were the efficacy, the economics, not just the economics today, but the economics into the future, the sustainability, the impacts that it might have on nature and very important ecosystems and habitats on the island. Obviously have to be consistent with the Captiva plan, as Carrie has shown us, and permittable in the required preserve. We're swearing a quiet preserve, so they just won't allow us anything to be built. It's important as I go through that, I'm going to show you the design elements and put them all together in the designs. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it's interesting. It's almost like you have I don't know why I use this analogy. It's popped into my head early on and I can't get it out. Mr. Potato Head, right? Like you can pick a different nose, you can pick a different ear, you can pick all these different components to put together and make the best one that you want. Sorry, I know. My brain goes strange places sometimes. But at any rate, these elements that I'm going to show you are all interconnected. They're designed to be used together and complement one another. And it's important that no matter what you're talking about, all adaptation strategies are going to require some kind of maintenance through time, just like you have to keep nourishing your beaches every few years. All right, so design elements. We have things like mangrove seedlings. These are individual mangrove seedlings. I know it's kind of fake, but they'll look like this in the adaptation designs I show you. This is what they look like if you were to go out and try to look at them in nature. Their purpose is a very inexpensive approach to encourage mangrove recovery and propagation. But they will only work in areas that have low exposure to wave or some kind of protection, otherwise waves or tidal flow that would wash them away. So there's kind of limited places where you can use those. Another design element that's very important, extremely important actually, are young mangroves. These are, rather than seedlings, they're well-established mangroves, but not large ones, but bigger ones that can kind of, stand up on their own. Again, the same reason they help restore mangroves that may have been removed or thinned, and they encourage propagation of the mangrove fringe. They can be used in locations where, again, where they've been removed, and they're used in places where that tidal flow is too fast, it would wash away seedlings. Salt-tolerant vegetation is also something to consider at the land's edge, so not building this out, but at the land's edge, in that, it provides, if you're going to elevate the land, which you'll see in some of our designs, is actually putting in fill and making, the edge of your backyard, if you're on the bay side, a little bit higher in elevation, it helps to hold the fill in place. If it gets a little salt water on it, it'll be fine. Let's see, next I have upland mangroves. That's just an option. Obviously, ecosystem diversity is very important. A very healthy ecosystem has diversity, so having a range of mangrove species. And again, these can be used in areas where their mangroves have been removed, but these mangroves can survive outside of the type of. Just a couple more. These are now getting more in from maybe away from nature-based and getting into things that we kind of construct. One of them, and you'll see this a lot in my designs, is a protected berm or feeder berm. It's kind of cool. You can put it offshore, and it's going to look like this in the designs, and it's just what it just looks like, this little lump of sediment, but it's intended in many cases to actually erode. And as it erodes, it provides more sediment to encourage mangroves to propagate. So it actually helps to elevate the land. So it's kind of like a re-nourishment, ongoing re-nourishment. Another really cool adaptation design element are these reef balls. How many people have ever seen or heard of reef balls? I see a couple heads nodding. Yeah, they're really cool. This is actually a coastal park right down the street from my house in St. Petersburg. That the Tampa Bay Estuary program is putting in. But what they are is their concrete is poured into fiberglass molds. So they're pretty strong, they're pretty heavy, they can provide protection, but they're hollow and they have holes. Juvenile fish love these things. So they really encourage They provide refuge for fish, and they're really popular in nursery areas. And they can be used in areas of high tidal flow and wave exposure, where you need something a little bit harder to protect the things that you're trying to build. You'll also see in my designs, I think it's like, we're getting toward the end of the design here, a rock sill. A rock sill is kind of like riprap, but it's like small, it's on a smaller scale. The rocks themselves are smaller, they're more like cobble size, and they're put together kind of interlocked. And again, they can be used at the base of things like the sediment berms, and to help provide protection from storms or tidal flow. And finally, using natural things like coir logs, they look like this, inside of like the feeder berm. And again, it gives it a little bit more strength, a little bit more see. Okay, so hopefully you took a lot of that in. Is there any way I can move this talking? So this is conceptual design. It's kind of covered at the top, but this is for the area of Chadwick Bayou. And I kind of want to orient you. So here's the road, so it's like Captiva Road. We know we have existing mangroves. We've got some houses over to the west here, and there's a swale on the west side of the road. What you're looking at with these colors is this little bit darker blue line is the current mean high water, and the upper one, the slightly paler blue, is mean high water plus 2 feet of sea level rise. So what we're doing is we're going to create a feeder berm that will prevent that 2 feet of sea level rise from actually even getting into the landscape. And in the meantime, put in mangrove seedlings to include, to try and get that mangrove fringe to grow out. As the feeder berm slowly erodes, it's going to provide sediment to help and encourage those mangroves to grow. Elevating the road is another. It's an accommodation strategy. So getting that road higher, doing that not only gets the road up out of danger, but it also provides an acts as levee to prevent the higher sea levels from reaching back into the properties that are to the west of Plantation Road. What I did on the next one.
So Cheryl, this is your first adaptation area.
Correct.
And this is the area.
For around Chadwick Bayou.
Right, the Captiva Bayou, and where you've got Plantation Drive going through South Seas is the main road going through South Seas. And what this is showing us that when we get to 2 feet of sea level rise, if we don't do anything, we get to 2 feet of sea level rise, which might be 20 years from now, might be 30 or 40, but somewhere in that. Plantation Drive is going to be underwater. And the houses on the other side are going to probably be starting to be underwater, if we don't do anything. And so what you're showing here is, how are you going to block the rising sea from coming across? You're saying it's going to come across, but we're going to have our first line of defense is going to be that the mound off the Drive Street, and then you're going to raise Plantation Drive.
Correct.
Which is going to prevent the rising sea from going past Plantation Drive and starting to attack the houses in South Seas.
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.
Wait, can I
Yeah, Carol.
allow you to talk with, me well, I think there's a increasing belief in studies like yours that what is not important is averages, but volatility. And so 2 feet on average, what you're really concerned about is the storm. And earlier on, there was a graph with a nice red line that went like this, and all these peaks and things went like that. I'm not concerned about this line.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about the top line.
So
So you mentioned storms are not in this, but storms are almost the most important thing. So you need the money to do that. I mean,
it's not telling the whole picture without storms, but essentially a storm, in our analysis, we evaluated, so let me two pieces to your comment. One is that we didn't use the flat line to get that 2 feet. It was in 2020, we used the NOAA projected sea level intermediate high curve to get our water level. So we were on that.
But I'm not worried about the slope, I'm worried about the extreme event.
The extreme event, if Cat 1 hurricane were to, hit Captiva, that would be the equivalent in our analysis to 7 feet of sea level rise. If it's 7 feet of sea level rise,
This plan isn't gonna work. Right?
yes, that's right.
There's part of it where we have to take care of every day, and then there are going to be storm events as well that we have to live with some water. And they'll come in and then they'll go out, which is what Captiva is today. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
We could go higher. We could go higher. But in the initial look at it is we felt that if we could do 2 feet, we're doing pretty well. And then let's learn from that, and then if we need to go higher, we keep going.
But Carol, your point is 100%
Yes.
valid,
Exactly.
that we're not looking at storminess at this part, we're just looking at the bathtub. You know.
It's a little more than the bathtub. It
Yeah.
actually takes the landscape, the topography, and.
Right, but I mean, we're just saying, if sea level rises, it starts to flood, that's right, but before the sea level starts rising this much, you're absolutely correct, that before we get to those events, you're gonna have the up and down events
Mhm.
that we're gonna have to deal with, and that's gonna be part of CPPD's mission as they go further this work.
So let me go to the conclusion. Can you risk profile that?
Even how often are we gonna have storms?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
probability issue?
And probabilities are increasing with the climate change.
Right.
We know that.
So what we do know is what the science knows now is that the frequency of storms isn't statistically shown to increase, but the frequency of more intense storms. So what might have been a tropical system, 20 years ago could turn into a Cat 1 or higher now, and that's going to happen more often. There are statistical approaches to being able to develop a potential curve, but it's just a probabilistic forecast. No one knows if it's going to come true, but all we have to base it on is what's happened historically, and then some model. And yeah, it can be done, but I'm not sure how much it would really, what it would really tell you when you're trying to do something like action start.
Thank you.
If some of the models actually do things like, they would look and see what it would look like in Charlie, what it looks like in Marhc. But then that's not where it's gonna come next time, probably, so it's. We're trying to figure out sort of the basics here, we can go far, but there's no question.
I don't need to belabor this because we're starting to get late, but this was just an overhead perspective, to kind of show, what it would look like if you were in an airplane looking down, like the feeder berm along the coast, the mangrove seedlings. These are existing mangroves. This is the road that would be raised. And you can put in features like rain gardens, which are meant for storms to run off with plants that can actually like be flooded occasionally. This second design that I'm showing here is for the area around Buck Key. Remember, or it's behind Buck Key. It's kind of in the middle of south. Anyway, it's in the middle portion of where the entire part of Captiva is protected by Buck Key. In this case, we examined the conditions again. We have low, very low, if any, wave exposure there, but you do have some medium to high tidal influence and a medium to high gradient. Here, we suggested putting in fill. Again, what we're trying to do is elevate the landscape. Why are we doing that? Because we want to establish a nice mangrove fringe out there, and we've got to give it something substrate to sit on. And in this case, we actually are elevating, putting fill in the edge of the land, rising above that 2 foot of sea level rise. So right now there's an existing rock profile, which would make this yard flood with 2 feet of sea level rise. If you put in a fill, elevate the land to help protect the house, and put in some salt tolerant vegetation there in the cases where it does get wet. Again, the overhead, the fill, the mangrove seedlings, young mangroves, and the salt tolerant vegetation as well as raising the land. All right, conceptual design 5 is actually the area around Line Pass. So it's the area that's at the confluence of Roosevelt Channel and Line Pass itself. There's fairly high possible exposure in waves, and fairly high tidal flow through the area. Track program shows the design element of a reef wall, because the reef walls can take a lot of water forcing on them. Planting young mangroves, because mangrove seedlings really wouldn't take here because the tidal flow is too high. And the idea here of young mangroves is just, you have some existing mangroves, let's widen that further, because we know that that is healthier and provides the best protection. Raising the elevation of the yard by putting some fill in, and again, you see that salt tolerant vegetation. Okay, I'm not going to go into the detail on those just for a matter of time. All right, this is designed for area 2. That was an area within the village, and actually for priority areas 2 or 3, there's lots of places in the village where there are existing seawalls, and some places where there aren't existing seawalls. So this is for the area with no existing seawall. But because there is wave exposure and high tidal flow, we actually create this berm and put 4 logs in the center to kind of help lock that berm in place. And you can put a rock sill at the toe, so that helps protect it from some wave action. So it does start thinking about storminess potential, right? Because with waves hitting, this would help protect the berm. Planting young mangrove, raising the elevation of the yard, and again, in this case, suggesting that maybe something could be to plant black mangroves to get some diversity in the mangrove fringe that you have. And then I think this might be the final one. Right. This is for an area in the village that already has an existing seawall, has the same conditions, potential for exposure, high exposure to waves, medium, maybe high tidal flow, not a lot of room to work with. Here we put in a very sizable berm, getting it well above that 2 foot of sea level rise. Again, taking into account that the reason why it's so high is because if a storm comes, it allows for erosion. And so there's still something left, but it's a sustainable design. The 4 logs help rock it in place. The rock sills help protect it from wave energy. And then again, in front of existing seawalls, what tends to happen is scour, and you lose the habitat that exists in front of seawalls. So what we're trying to do is provide this really nice fortified protection, but a hybrid fortified protection, and plant young mangroves and mangrove seedlings to encourage some of the mangrove fringe out seaward or channelward of the seawall, and then sometime in the future, maybe it's the right thing to do is to actually raise the elevation of an existing seawall. And yeah, so that were the designs. Again, I know it's kind of a lot, and there's a lot of detail in there. You have it in your packet. It'll be posted on, on the community website at some point in the technical memorandum. So I'll wrap up by just kind of summarizing and iterating some kind of key points that, we evaluated a variety of adaptation options. We really were looking for things that work interconnectedly, right? So using multiple elements for the best success and the best sustainability. Consideration again of the water issue. Again, looking at 2 feet of sea level rise, but we did incorporate some protection from storm features in our design elements. It's not going to protect the house or the Cat 1, but you get a good strong tropical storm through here, and some of the those feeder birds might erode as opposed to just letting the water come straight in. It provides the first line of defense. And again, I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to keep in mind that no matter what you do, it's going to require maintenance through time. So that has to be taken into account with any kind of planning and policy changes. So with that, I think.
Okay, most of your designs rely on fill projects.
Yep.
So generally, you look on the backside, the A side of the island. Most of those lots just slope right down, into the bay side. You've got most of the houses along Roosevelt Channel are not even gonna take 2 feet of sea level rise. You know, before your house is gonna be permanently surrounded by water, let alone be further aggravated by the increased storm as Cheryl, you know, brought up. So long term, before we get to 2 feet of sea level rise, our island is probably looking at very substantial fill going across the backside, you know, of the island, and then holding that fill in place. With like, riprap, I don't know what's the right word, riprap or the logs and things like that, other elements that you talked about, that'll prevent the inundation. And then in front of those, we're going to be trying to promote increased vegetation growth, because mangroves do a good job of protecting against the winds.
Yeah, so
You know,
provide
storms,
that.
waves,
Yeah.
yeah, they break down the waves coming in, so we're probably just speaking in very generalized terms now. You're looking at fill across the back of the island, and then a lot of planning to encourage further development of our natural shoreline, which will preserve the habitat that we have there, but also that increased vegetation will work to diminish the effect.
She pointed out feeder birds too.
Yes.
Which is an integral part. I was talking about storm surge, which has absolutely nothing to do with this.
With this, that, you know, we've looked at just, you know, sea level rise itself, we have not taken on the task, which, you know, you all at CPD will be doing.
Storm
Is
surge.
forecasting increased storm, storm surge, you know, how to deal with those. So it may seem like, you know, we're just kind of at the starting point here, but from what I've seen, we're far ahead, even with the little we've done so far, far ahead of most other communities have done and started to think about this, how we're gonna deal with it.
Keeping in line with what Jay was just speaking about, going back to your last conceptual design, section E, where it shows the sediment cedar berm. Looks like it's pretty far away from what is the existing seawall. Can you, this is not to scale, I imagine, so could you give us some idea about how far out from the existing seawall you expect that feeder berm to be built? What does that do for boating, docks, et cetera, et cetera?
So, yeah, absolutely, you know, yeah, keep in mind, that's why we call it conceptual design, so it all comes down to how much room do you have to work with. So, you know, it would have to be accommodated for all the things that you're talking about. I mean, boats generally, unless you have a dock there, aren't gonna, you know, most boaters are using the center part of the channel unless they're drifting or fishing or whatever. So it just, you know, that how wide that zone is, that's what I was talking about with accommodation space. So you can take this whole design and squish it a little bit if you don't have the room, or you can spread it out further.
But, yeah, Lisa, you know, your point is a good one, you know, docks will be impacted by these designs. Right now, docks cannot extend further into the waterway than 4 feet, you know, of depth.
So this, for example, this is the overhead of that, sorry to interrupt you, Jay, but
No,
you
go
know,
ahead.
it's showing the dock and the length of the dock, and it's showing that all that, the material that's being put in, all the adaptation components are, you know, don't exceed the length of the dock.
Just lengthy, just change the rules.
We're gonna need to pass around the mic.
Okay, so bottom line is you just lengthen the dock. And that takes procedures and rules, scripting.
If you try to increase your docks going out into the.
Yeah, but
I have,
I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
I just feel that if we're having a big plan.
Yeah.
We can plan and make our docks.
Yeah.
And write the language to show the legislators what box to sign and what to work.
Right.
A question, you're offshore in property that's permanently covered with water. or at least most of the time. Who is actually the owner of that land? Is that the property owner? Is it the state? Is it the county? Or is it the federal government? And do those parties all get together to figure out how to pay for all this?
Okay, you had a hand.
The state of Florida owns it, and we'll have to see. That will be one, we're here at the beginning of the process, and this is not an immediate process. This is a step-by-step, which is why we're working the way we are. And we're gonna have to see how it gets funded and how it finally gets designed. We're just getting to the point where we're understanding that we need to do something, and there are some suggestions. There are some good implementation strategies that can be further refined. And as more information comes in, as they discuss, this is a field that is just burgeoning. And as more information comes in and people learn more, we'll be able to adapt, which is the other thing we're talking about, the adaptation strategies. We will be able to adapt as time goes by. We've got a lot of steps to do now, and we're not ready to pay for it yet.
So I want to add to that, for instance, in 2021, the legislature, Florida legislature put $1 billion toward Resilient Florida program. They added additional funds to that program this year. So the state is starting to recognize the need for funding projects like this. In some cases, they're funding studies like this one. In other cases, they're funding the implementation of actual projects.
My question kind of dovetails on what this gentleman in front of me was asking. It's kind of curious to me, what is the timeline that you're anticipating? Because I know as I came down here, there's construction going on now, and undoubtedly there's going to be construction ongoing in the future. And so, and then kind of the dovetail onto that is, how is Lee County factoring into this? How is the development community factoring into this? And then how does the state factor into this? Because those are all different types of stakeholders in this as well.
Yeah.
So, excuse me, I have to dovetail with you guys. The reason you're handing it to the CEPD is we are a special tax district. We have the legal authority. And when I say legal authority, I mean we are tasked as elected officials to create the verbiage and laws for the island to protect the island resiliency. That's why it's going there. We are an existing legal entity. And that's why everything is coming to us now. And now we're going to be tasked with dealing with the county, dealing with the state, like we have with the beach nourishment. So to answer everyone's question here, it is now the task of the CEPD to take this to make it happen.
Just
Linda's in charge. She's the new coordinator.
I want to raise this question about permits and the permits that will be required to do these various projects. What is the community panel's conclusion as far as permitting, and could we be surprised? In other words, we have a wonderful plan, but we can't get it permitted.
So we did try to consider some of the permitting, the broad permitting issues. But as a lot, if you're familiar with permitting processes, they can be long and arduous and difficult to get through. And that's a whole other component of adaptation plan. You know, that is, you know, getting a matrix of the permitting actions in place would be required before you can settle on a design. All we're trying to do here is think about what are some of the things that we could consider. And then there's the steps before they would ever go to construction. There's a lot of work to be done in between there. CEPD.
We have to go. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I've seen a study of the entire coastal United States on sea level rise that suggests that there are 2 or 3 places along the entire U.S. coast that are especially vulnerable to subsidence being a very, very important component of sea level rise. And I thought I remember that study saying that Southwest Florida, our area, was one of those really susceptible areas to subsidence. Is that?
So there is a historical record of some subsidence in Southwest Florida. It's relative to places like the northern Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi Delta. It's actually quite minimal. So it's not a really concern to be taken into account on, you know, when we're talking about these types of things.
Cheryl, you mentioned there were places around the state that are already implementing some of this adaptation. Could you mention where some of those are in case we might have an opportunity to actually see what it looks like?
Yeah, well, actually, Tampa Bay Estuary Program has implemented a lot of those. They recently built a living shoreline all around McGill Air Force Base and other places. It's a little bit different, but you know, Miami is probably on the forefront of doing some otherwise adaptation strategies, although a lot of those are dealing with oceanfront storm issues rather than estuary flooding. But I'd say that you're kind of like closest example that's very, very equivalent would be the areas around Tampa Bay.
I will just interject too, is that SCCF, but it's okay, I can talk about it. Oh, for the people at home. That SCCF is working on a living shoreline project outside of the Ring Road right now.
That's right.
So that's a good example, you know, so that's an establishment right now, but that's a good example of what something would look like. And so that's something to keep an eye on.
One question now from Zoom land.
Can we just, there's a follow-up, the question was, where is Woodring Road? Close to the causeway. It's around, it's, the bay side, close to the causeway, you got the point that goes way out there. That's
Around the entrance to Tarpon Bay is where Woodring Road is.
well, on the other side of Tarpon Bay.
Well, you can,
Yes.
you're both right.
Yes.
Tarpon Bay is one end, and the other end is, and what's the other end? Dixie Beach Boulevard.
Okay. So I think we have a Zoom question.
Yeah, the Zoom question was about how big are reef balls?
Let's see, 3 feet tall and about that, 3 feet tall and maybe a circumference of 2 feet-ish. Roughly, I was acting one out, but if you're on Zoom, I'm not sure if you can see what you're
There's a lot of talk about mangroves and the importance of mangroves and planting mangrove, living shorelines, etc. What is the time length if mangroves don't, the seedlings don't get washed out? How long does it take to get a mature mangrove forest with all those roots and all those things that actually start to trap sediments and accumulate sediments? And I'm thinking that's a 20-year process.
mangroves grow, I'm not a biologist.
Okay.
The mangroves grow very quickly though. And I mean, I've even heard anecdotal stories about right here at the south end of Captiva, flying past certain areas that didn't have any mangroves 10 years ago are just, you know, filled with mangroves now. So they are a very fast growing plant. I can't tell you though exactly how fast they go.
It's also a good reason to start now.
Yeah, it's a good reason. Also, in some cases, they can keep up with sea level rise if they have enough sediment in the right cases, which is why she's doing the sediment berms.
I see.
Okay, so that's a tricky little thing, and the scientists have just been learning about this. So in the designs, it's gonna be important to do the design well, then monitor what goes on, and we're gonna screw some things up.
Right.
And keep going and improve.
So those berms are actually providing
Correct.
more sediment than might normally occur through wave action, et cetera, to
Correct, so that
accumulate.
we So watch, and so is that these mangroves keep growing up, these keep going up, mangroves go up. That's sort of cool.
Wait,
You want people in Zoom land to be able to hear you. Do the feeder birds have to be nursed to go through that?
Absolutely, yeah, they will have to be renourished through time and probably after any substantial storm events. It's again, it's part of the longer term maintenance plan.
If you studied 1 foot or 3 foot, would your answer be different, or is this the answer regardless?
So we did look at 1 foot, and found that, it wasn't, but the committee, decided that it really wasn't, they weren't overly concerned with 1 foot. We didn't look at 3 feet, but we did look at 7 feet, but they felt that there was enough potential hazard at 2 feet that if there was no real reason to move on to 3 feet, because that's not the
So the
question.
answer,
That's not a question.
that's not the question. The question is this the answer regardless of whether it's 1, 2, or 3 feet?
Sorry.
I would say, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
sorry, I misunderstood.
Yes, and kids, let's get going, let's get doing this. Okay, and maybe that we don't go up all the way at the beginning, or maybe
Right.
somebody is really wants to go higher, I don't know. Okay? It's basic for, yes, we could put seawalls everywhere, it would be very, very expensive, they will scour, they'll fall in the crack, it's not.
And you lose your habitat.
And we lose the habitat for the fish, and the water gets worse, and da, 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 da. But we did look at it, but it's the most expensive option.
How much rise have we had in the last 10 years, the last 20 years? 3 inches?
Yeah, well, roughly that, Danny, this is all, the rate of rise that we've been experiencing is very, very slow compared to the projected scenarios.
And if
Yeah,
it
we
keeps
get out.
going at that rate, we're gonna be really happy.
Yeah.
Amen.
Okay? And we're trying to measure right now, we put in our own tidal gauge on Captiva, so we can measure what's happening.
Build a taller seawall.
Was there another question?
Yeah, I did have a question, and I apologize if I missed this in the opening remarks, but is this an informational exchange, or are you looking for comments back from folks, or I guess, what are the next steps?
What is the purpose of this meeting?
Well, I get that it's informational, but it's just solely information sharing at this point, kind of providing a status update kind of thing?
Well, if this is for the community, and the solution is for the community. If the community doesn't like any of it or whatever, we want to know. Okay, so if the community has feedback, we want to know. Because to do this is going to require the will of Captiva. Okay, and so we're sort of setting it up. Now, David's going to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna say something.
Here's the silver tongue for it.
I didn't hear what you said, but in answer to your question, about 5 years ago, we had a forum on sea level rise. And there was a debate between an engineer who said it's been very slow over the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, so it's going to continue with that rate. And then we had a professor from one of the universities who said that's nonsense because the rising temperatures and the melting ice and it's going to go like this. And some people are saying, why are we talking about this? It's just going to lower property values. And that's what took place during that meeting. And then the community panel created a sea level rise committee. And the sea level rise committee did a vulnerability analysis. And we saw what it's going to look like in 2 years, with 2 feet of sea level rise going to about 2050. And that scared the hell out of us, because we saw the whole bayside was going to be inundated, and that's going to affect the road in Captiva, et cetera. The Gulf side, because of the beach renourishment, looks safer, but the bayside is going to be a problem. South Seas, you wouldn't be able to get into South Seas if there's a real problem, you couldn't get off the island. So we created the Sea Level Rise Committee. Cheryl did this vulnerability study, it was terrific. She then came up with these conceptual resiliency options for us to take a look at. But we can't fund it, the Captiva Community Panel can't fund it. CEPD then extended their jurisdiction because they legally could do it, not just doing beach renourishment, but doing the base side of resiliency. At that point, the Captiva Community Panel then decided, look, we will close out our project. This is everything we've learned over the last 20 years. This is the vulnerability analysis. This is the different kinds of options we can look at. CEPD, please absorb everything we've learned, everything the community's learned. And now you're going to have to decide what to do. So CEPD at this point is about to get a proposal from some of their engineering firms and other firms to figure out what kind of sea level rise resiliency we can do. And they will look at that. That proposal will come in, the community will see it. It will hopefully absorb a lot of what we've already learned. It will be vetted by the community, and at some point it'll be funded. It'll either be funded from grants from the state or the federal government or the county, or be funded through us, our taxation that CPD can do. And that's how we're gonna do this. So we're gonna turn it over to CPD. They're gonna come up with a comprehensive plan, absorb what we learned, bring it back to the community, and hopefully we'll have something done in time for when we're facing the problem.
Thank you, David.
I just wanted to mention that we are not the Captiva Beach Renourishment District. We are the Captiva Erosion Prevention District. Our job is to prevent erosion, and that's what this all this effort is